Hello, I'm Martin Cothran with Memoria Press. I'm the editor of the Classical Teacher magazine, and I'm the author of Traditional Logic, Books 1 and 2, and also Material Logic, and also Classical Rhetoric. And I've been asked today to talk a little bit about logic. So I've got a list of questions that I frequently get asked by people, and then, of course, I think there's an opportunity for you to ask questions as well, and so we'll answer those as quickly as we can get to them. So I'm just going to start out with some really basic things, okay? The first thing is, what is logic? Logic is basically the science of sound reasoning. So you're really doing two things with it. You are trying to determine whether arguments are valid or invalid. That's the first thing. The second thing is simply the procedure of getting from one truth to, or a set of truths to another truth. Okay, that's basically what logic does. You have two premises and you have a conclusion, and you've got to figure out how to get from the premises to the conclusion, or how to determine whether that conclusion that is there underneath those two premises is validly or necessarily follows from the two premises. Now, that sounds a little technical, but basically it's how to argue. Okay, this is something we use quite a lot in our society. The Greeks invented the art of logic, and that's not a cultural mistake, because the Greeks were very argumentative people. There was some ancient writer who talked about how he had visited Greece. He was from another country, how he had visited Athens, and he came back and he wrote, he said, these people are always arguing with each other. They're always suing each other. It's a very litigious society. And really, if you look at our society, we're very much like the Greeks in that regard. We argue a lot. We sue each other a lot too, unfortunately. It's good just to try to keep it at an argument and not have to bring it before the court, right? So that's generally speaking what logic is. Another question I get is, what's the difference between traditional logic and material logic? Now, those are the two terms used in my book. In reality, you have one big thing called traditional logic. And then you have, coming out of it, two things. One is formal logic. So my traditional logic books actually mean formal logic. And the other is material logic. Those are the two branches that come out of the study of traditional logic, formal and material. And the difference is, formal logic is the process or the mechanics of arguing. So that's where you're really studying validity. In a sense, truth doesn't matter in that study. The question is not whether something is true or not. The question is, if you have these truths in your premises, does the conclusion have to also be true? Okay, but it's sort of like the difference between formal logic in that regard and material logic. Material logic, which is the study of the words you use in an argument. It's the study of the statements that you use in an argument. And then it's the study of whole arguments and the different types of arguments there are. It's more content type of issues as opposed to the mechanics of something. So the analogy I always like to draw is, you have a recipe, okay? Everyone knows this. You have a recipe. Well, there's two aspects to a recipe. The first aspect is the ingredients, okay? And the second is what you do with the ingredients. Formal logic is like what you do with the ingredients. How much to put in of this and that, how long to cook it for, all those kinds of issues. Those are all procedural questions in a recipe. So the recipe for logic, in the recipe for logic, formal logic is that aspect of it. Material logic is looking at the contents, the ingredients of your recipe. If you have bad ingredients, you can do all the right things in your recipe in terms of how long to cook it and what the percentage of things to put in that you want, but if the ingredients are bad, it's still not going to taste good. Okay, so both of those things are very important. So that's basically the difference between traditional and material logic. Now, the other question I get is between formal logic and informal logic. That's just what I just said. Formal logic is what's studied in my traditional logic, and then informal logic is the same thing as material logic. So that's really the same question. People don't realize that. And again, if you're just joining us, I'm Martin Cothran with Memoria Press. I'm the author of Traditional Logic 1 and 2, and we're talking about logic. I just talked a little bit about what it is. Another question I get is, what should you do before starting logic? I get this question a lot. And I think that what people think that there's some other thinking skills course they need to study before logic. And in one sense there is, and in one sense there isn't. You don't need to go looking for a program that has the words thinking skills course on it. All right. All you need to do to be prepared for logic is, these are my two recommendations, Latin and math. Those are the two things that will help you to study logic. Now, that doesn't mean that if you don't have any Latin under your belt, you can't study logic. But logic is like a lot of subjects, in that it involves two basic abilities. And, this term critical thinking skills gets thrown around a lot. Most people don't even know what it means. The two most basic thinking skills are analysis and synthesis. Taking things apart, making distinctions, and synthesis, putting things together or seeing resemblances. Those are the two things that go across all intellectual subjects, okay? This is, and this is certainly true in logic. There's a big distinction, for example, between quantity and quality. It's a very important distinction when you study formal logic. You do this in Latin all the time. You're having to make distinctions in nouns between gender, number, and case, grammatical case. When you have verbs, you have to make these distinctions between person and number. You have to make multiple distinctions, okay? So that study of any inflected language, we recommend Latin because it's, you're learning an academic vocabulary, most of which in English is Latinate, and you are really learning grammar better and more easily than you would in English. So really, Latin and math are your two best preparations for logic. If you don't have those, you're still probably doing something in other subjects, but those are the best. I think those are the best. All right. Which type of logic should be studied first? Okay, we're talking about formal versus material or informal logic. I would say it's almost always better to study formal logic first, okay? Material logic is, I think students like to be shown the order of something so that they can really see how it works. And that's what formal logic does for you. You are given the rules. There's certain steps you need to follow. It's very organized and structured. And so it's a lot easier, I think, for a middle schooler, which is as early as you want to teach logic, to do, okay? Material logic is very philosophical. It's conceptually more difficult than formal logic. So really that's something that's best left till later. There's not, the rules are not as hard and fast, and it's not as structured. So I always recommend that you do formal logic before informal or material logic, because material logic really, in a sense, is an introduction to philosophy. That's something that's best left till certainly high school, maybe even a little bit later in high school. And that brings up the question. I know a lot of teachers who like to teach fallacies first, informal fallacies. Okay, well, first of all, they teach this before formal logic. They're studying invalid reasoning before they're studying valid reasoning. I don't know of any other subject in which you study the wrong thing first and the right thing later. It just doesn't make pedagogical sense, for one thing. And for another, teaching fallacies, you're not teaching your kids really many skills. You're teaching them to identify things. But since they have not studied the rules of valid reasoning, it's very hard for them to understand why they're wrong. So I'm not sure it's a great use of time. Some people think it's fun. But my students in logic have quite a lot of fun figuring out valid reasoning in formal logic. So I don't really know that I see that as much of an advantage of doing it that way. Do all logic courses have to be completed before starting rhetoric? I would recommend doing it that way, and here's why. Rhetoric involves three things, okay? It involves ethos, logos, and pathos. It's a study of virtue, because the first thing that convinces people of what you're saying is your character, that you wouldn't tell them wrong, that you have enough expertise to know what you're talking about, that you have some humility, so you wouldn't say more than you know. Okay, that's one reason you find somebody convincing. Okay, the other thing, one of the other three things is pathos, which is, does the speaker make you want to believe him? Is he grabbing your emotions and making you want to believe him? But the third thing is logos, which is logic. Okay, so logic is about 1/3 of rhetoric. And you're not going to learn it in rhetoric. You got to learn it in logic. You got to sort of bring it with you into logic. So really, it's better to study how to reason validly before you study persuasion in rhetoric. Okay, so that's the sequence that I would follow here. In regard to rhetoric, I just kind of explained what it is. It's ethos, logos, and pathos. Character of the speaker, the rational strength of the arguments in a speech, and the ability of the speaker to enroll your emotions in his case. Okay, and so another question I get is our rhetoric program a debate program? No, it is not. All right, the way to learn debate is to debate. Okay, you can, I think rhetoric is a good study to do while you are learning to debate, but it's like any kind of speech. A debate is a kind of speech, right? It's an argumentative speech. Well, the best thing to do is just to do it. You have to be used to being up in front of people. You have to, have a presence of mind when you're talking in front of a crowd. That's an acquired skill. Okay, you just have to do it in order to get that. But studying rhetoric and logic, before doing that and while you're doing it and after you do it is something you also want to do. Rhetoric is, I would say, the study of rhetoric is a necessary condition for debate, but it's not a sufficient condition for being able to debate well, if that makes any sense. Okay. All right. And again, I'm Martin Cothran with Memoria Press, editor of Classical Teacher magazine. You may have read some of our articles in there. And then I'm the author of Traditional Logic, Books 1 and 2, Material Logic, and Classical Rhetoric. And we've been talking about logic. I just talked a little bit about rhetoric. Another question I get from people, whether it's homeschoolers who are putting together the grades for their kids, or a school teacher, is what kind of credit can I use? Do I assign to logic in high school? At Highlands Latin, what we put on the transcript is logic. All right, and that's actually pretty impressive, I think, for college recruiters. But I think what a lot of people are concerned about is these Carnegie units. There's so many years of English you have to have, there's like these boxes you have to fill. Well, you could do this in a number of ways. I know a lot of people want to put logic under mathematics. If you're doing formal logic, and I'll talk about that in a second. If you're talking about traditional logic is a language art. What I would do is I would put it in the English box. Okay. If you're studying modern logic, which we don't do because it's not the kind of logic that you use in an argument, it's not a language art, and we're doing classical education, which is the trivium, and the trivium is language arts. Okay, that's why we're doing traditional logic. That's what was done in the old trivium. But if you're doing modern logic, that is math. Okay, and you could put a modern logic course under mathematics on your transcript. But I suggest doing it. It's a language art. It would come under English. That's what I would do. All right. And let me talk a little bit about that. The difference between traditional logic, which is what we do, and modern logic, which is what a lot of other people do. There's a lot of modern logic in college logic programs, for example. I was a philosophy major, and most of what we studied in our logic classes was modern symbolic logic. That's those if P then Q, P therefore Q types of arguments, which I remember running into that in my high school math course. Okay, it was in math for a reason. And so what modern logic is a great study if you're going into computer science, all right, because it's the way computers think. Modern logic is the way computers think. Traditional logic is the way human beings think. Human beings have a soul. They can understand or grasp the essences of things, which are what we refer to when we use nouns in our language. Okay, when we say man, we mean human nature. Okay, and that's important in philosophical reasoning. Again, traditional logic is the kind of reasoning you actually use in an argument. You do not use all of the symbolic things, and you're not doing theorems and proofs and all this stuff in an actual debate. Okay, and I guess we have a question from someone in our audience, and so the wonderful Allie English is going to ask this question.
For students who've completed logic and rhetoric, where do you see these skills enriching their other studies? I would love to hear examples you've seen in the classroom.
Okay, well, the first thing is this: English, or more specifically, composition. The most common mistake made when we try to get our students to write argumentative papers is that they want to engage in assertion. Okay, they just want to say something. They don't offer any evidence for it. They don't offer any argument for it. They just want to say it. And they think their audience, whoever's reading the paper, is supposed to accept this. This is a big problem. And so what a good logic course will enable your child to do is to make a competent argument in an argumentative paper. And I will tell you that they will be having to write those kinds of papers time after time when they get to college, okay? The paper writing, and very few students can do it well, all right? That's the complaint I hear from college professors is that students don't know how to write. They don't know grammar. They don't know how to write. They don't know how to argue. So they're making them write an argumentative paper when they don't know either argument or how to write very well. So I think that's the biggest thing that you will see. And I think that just, another thing you do in a classical curriculum is you discuss literature, for example, and history. There's a lot of discussion, and you have to be able to say, you say you think a particular thing about this piece of literature or this history book, and you have to be able to state what you think and to defend that, okay? So what we do, and in fact, let me throw another distinction in here, and it's a distinction between a logic course and a course about logic, or a logic book and a book about logic. There's a lot of books out there about logic, but they don't teach you how to do it, okay? A logic course will teach you how to do this. So in our program, what your child is going to learn, he's going to learn how to test an argument for validity. He's going to learn the 19 valid ways of reasoning, and he's going to memorize the names of the 19 valid argument forms that somebody cooked up in the Middle Ages. And then he's going to be able to do two things. He's going to do these. He's going to be able to take an argument in one form and reduce it to a simpler form by looking at the letters in the name that William of Sherwood in the Middle Ages gave that argument. It's got all kinds of little puzzle clues in there of how to reduce it to a simpler form. He's also going to learn that the way we argue in real life, we take, when we argue in real life, well, let me start. When you're arguing in a logic course, you've got two premises and a conclusion, two reasons, and then what you conclude from those two reasons. In real life, we do what Aristotle called rhetorical arguments. We only say one reason, one premise, and a conclusion. So there's an assumption lying behind your reasoning or your opponent's reasoning, and you got to figure out what it is. Well, the way to do that is to back into the missing premise. So we train our students in our program to be able to back into that missing premise, which many times, if you're in a debate, is the thing your opponent is assuming that is the questionable issue. And so this is why a lot of debates, they're arguing past each other because nobody's paying attention to what that missing premise lurking in the background is. Well, the first thing you need to do in a debate is identify what that is. And this is the other thing on fallacies. I mentioned fallacies the study of fallacies doesn't really teach you how to think logically. A formal logic course does. When in a debate, when your opponent uses a fallacy, you don't say, well, you just committed the fallacy of undistributed middle. Well, nobody even knows what that means, okay? You do two things in a real argument. Here's what you do, and it involves backing into a missing premise. You argue with your opponent, you identify the questionable assumption your opponent has, and you either challenge it directly, or you take that assumption and plug in something else other than the issue you're talking about and show how that reasoning leads to absurdities, forcing your opponent to abandon his reasoning. Okay, you can't do that with a fallacies course. Or a course that teaches about logic but doesn't actually teach you how to use it. You have to know how to use logic in order to do that kind of thing, really to debate competently. Okay, we have another question.
I just started homeschooling my 8th grader, and he has never been exposed to rhetoric, logic, or Latin. He's also never been exposed to a classical education. Where should I begin with logic?
The same answer I give to everybody: you begin at the beginning. And the beginning is a formal logic course. So although it would help him to take Latin or really have studied some kind of formal grammar, it's not necessary, okay? He can still do it. And certainly in the 8th grade. And this gets into the issue of when do you start logic, among other things. And you can't start it really before 7th or 8th grade because they're really just starting to think analytically. This is the time, parents, when they start arguing with you, right? So you can't start before then. But 8th grade, certainly you could do that. If you're doing the traditional logic program in 7th or 8th grade, I recommend taking a year to do each book. So the 2 books will take you 2 years. If you're doing it in 9th grade or above, maybe 9th grade or above, certainly, you can do both the traditional logic books 1 and 2 in a year. So each one in a semester. Now, in the case of your 8th grader, the first book is not terribly difficult. I think, the way it paces you through it, it's got 15 lessons, and each one has 4 exercise units, so you could do 2 a week, and I think he would be fine. All right, and then when he gets to the end of that, if it was just really easy for him, you can do Traditional Logic Book 2 after that. Traditional Logic Book 2 is a more difficult program because it's dealing with more complex forms of reasoning. But if you can get that first book down, because my book 1 is really just going for one thing, so that your student will understand what deductive inference is. What is that magical thing that happens between the premises, the reasons in an argument, and the conclusion? This mystical, magical thing, deductive inference. It teaches you what that is and how it works. Then you can go on and get complicated with it in that second book. Okay. So again, Latin is not necessary. Formal logic would help. Formal grammar would help. But neither of those are completely necessary for it. It's just that they're helpful. If you're going to do something before logic, those are the things to do: Latin and math. Another question.
The Memoria Press website gives a wide range of appropriate grades, but have you found an ideal age for each of these courses? This really depends on the child. There are some 7th graders that are really ready for logic, and there are some 9th graders, maybe even 10th graders, who are not. But the nice thing about this course is that I got this call from an Orthodox rabbi one time, and he was using my logic program in a yeshiva school in New York. It's an Orthodox Jewish school. And he said, I have 2 or 3 shelves of logic books in my office, and yours is the only one that takes nothing for granted. Okay, which is the way we write all of our programs, really, is we assume you know nothing, all right? There's not any kind of knowledge specifically that you have to bring with you, all right? You just need to, have started thinking analytically, and sometimes that occurs earlier for children, sometimes that occurs later. So we write our programs for people who don't know the subject. All of our programs are that way. So that's why this program can be used in the 7th grade and still work, is because, that's about as young as you want to do it. But ideal age, I don't know that there is. It just depends on your child. Could be 7th grade, could be 9th grade, could be 10th grade. Another question. Are there any books you recommend for parents who have not been taught logic to help prepare them to teach their children? Yes,
traditional logic books 1 and 2. Again, I kind of answered that in the previous question, really, because this starts from the very beginning. It starts with just simple words. And I have the first 3 chapters are sort of a little mini philosophy course. It's when I have an idea. How is it that I get from the perception of something, this table I'm looking at here in our library, to an idea, the idea of tableness. Okay, that's not really complex. It's just things that you haven't thought about before. So we start out with words.
Nouns, what do we mean when we have an idea, when we start with a perception? It says there's just 3 steps, and we explain that. And kids love it because in one sense it's simple, and in another sense it's really a kind of lofty thought. So, and then we get in the 4th chapter into the 4 kinds of logical statements and this sort of thing. So really, I think, again, there's 2 answers to that question. I've given both of them already. One is, what do you do before you study logic, which, again, I would suggest Latin and math. And secondly, our program assumes you don't know anything, so it starts at the very beginning. So you can start with that program. Yeah. All right. So I hope this has helped. If you have any other questions, we do have a pamphlet called How to Teach Logic, and I strongly recommend that for somebody who just wants to know sort of the whole layout of logic. I've got a map, and it shows you all the different branches of logic. I think it's the only one in captivity. Okay, we have it right here. So it's in that brochure, and you can get it by going online and ordering that. So you might think about doing that. If you have any further questions, we have our forum that you can get on at any time you like. So hope this has helped. Thank you for joining us today.